welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Colossians by looking at the Christological hymn in chapter 1. In this episode, we're going to briefly look at what a hymn is, and then we're going to spend some time on the structure of the hymn because structure carries meaning. Now, it's kind of difficult to talk about structure on a podcast because it's audio only. So, for this episode, I did a screen share along with the audio so I can point out things visibly as we go along. I uploaded this to my YouTube channel, and there's a link to that in the description of this episode. Alternatively, you can go to mattdelockery.com and find a link there. Look for the social media links and click on the one for YouTube, the one with the play button. I highly recommend you watch this one because after we talk for a few minutes about what a hymn is and how we know these verses are a hymn, we're going to get into the actual structure of the hymn and things will stop making so much sense. So go check out my YouTube channel. However, if you really want to go for this on audio only, you're certainly welcome to. Either way, here we go. So, what is a hymn? In the modern church, we often think of hymns as songs because that's what gets sung in church. However, the hymns that we find in the New Testament are not really songs. You might put them to music, but that's not the primary intent. They're not poetry set to music. They're highly structured and very theologically dense pieces of material. We might do better to think of the word creed. Think of the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and so on and so forth. Some churches recite those all the time. Now you can set those to music, but that's not the main point. They are meant for theological instruction. Colossians 3:16 says that hymns, along with psalms and spiritual songs, should be used for teaching and admonishing one another. There have been efforts to separate these into distinct categories, but the terms are not technical and no such division can be made. Hymns contain teaching and wisdom that can and should be used as a foundation for helping one another. And this is important for us, because if there is a hymn here, then it will be the theological basis for the whole letter. The presence of a hymn depends on three things. 1, pronoun use. 2, vocabulary, style, and content. And 3, structure. Now, before you get worried that I'm going to get too technical, I promise I won't. I'm going to share a few brief things with you that let you know that we're looking at a hymn, and then we're going to move on. So first up is pronoun use. Now, if you look at the hymn and compare it with the surrounding verses, this is what you see. Verses 11 to 12, you see second and third person. 13 to 14, first and third. 15 to 20, third person only. And 21 to 23, second and third person with one first person. So what does all that mean? Well, basically what happens is there's sort of like a conversation going on, albeit it's one-sided because it's a letter. But think about when you're talking with somebody. You use a lot of second and first person, and some third when you're talking with them. Second person is like you. First person is I or we. So if you're having a conversation with somebody, it makes a lot of sense that you use I and you a whole lot, right? And third person happens when you're talking about, whoever else that doesn't happen to be present there at the moment. And in this case, since they're having a theological discussion, anytime you're talking about God or Jesus or so forth, you're talking third person. You're talking he, or if you're talking an idea, you're talking the it is the idea, or other people is they, so on and so forth. So what's happening is that there's this conversation going on, and Paul's talking to the Colossians, and then all of a sudden in verse 15 to 20, basically the conversation stops, and he's only referencing external material. And then in verse 21, we see the words, and you, and the conversation gets going again. So there's 6 verses in the middle here with no mention of the Colossian community, and it's third person only. So that's our first clue that there's something going on here, that the conversation stops and he's pulling in external material. See, I told you that wouldn't be too bad. That's all I'm going to say about pronouns. We're done. So second up is vocabulary, style, and content, and this is going to be even quicker. Now, much of the vocabulary in verses 15 to 20 is unusual for Paul. I'm not going to go on a list of all these things. I'm simply going to say that many of these terms are ones that appear only once in the New Testament. And an unusually high concentration of terms not found in other Pauline writings suggests the use of outside material. You're using words that Paul doesn't normally use. That means somebody else probably used them. And Paul's quoting them, right? Makes sense. Besides that, there are also the presence of indicators often found in hymns, and we're going to look at some of those in just a minute. But basically, you have those things plus a higher density of theological concepts in surrounding verses. And so when you put all this together, plus the structure that we're about to talk about, you say, okay, there's probably external material here, and it looks sort of like a hymn, so it's probably him. Now, we're done with all that. Time for structure. Again, we're doing this because structure carries meaning. So, here we go. I have in front of you verses 15 to 20 of Colossians 1, and I've got the ESV version pulled up. So if you want to follow along and you've got an ESV version, you can do that. I'm going to make a few modifications, and I'll explain those as I go along. I'm not changing what's there, but I'm trying to help the translation stand out a little bit. And you'll understand what I mean with this first one. Verse 15, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. He is. In Greek, this actually says who is, not he is. And here's my problem. I think English translations are really, really good. If you ever heard me talk about translations, you'll hear me say this exact same thing. English translations are really, really good. The problem is that sometimes they're a little too good. Sometimes they make things smooth that really aren't meant to be smooth, and this is one of those times. It says he is because it's trying to explain who the image of the invisible God is here. In reality, this says who is, and it's a reference back up to the beloved Son in verse 13 that we don't see here. But if you take out the he is and you put in who is, you miss something of the structure that's going on. Because there's a number of he is's in this hymn. You've got another one here. Look at verse 17. You've got one here in 18. And then you have another one here a little bit later in 18. All right, well, there's a bunch of he is's. But if you know that this one here in verse 18, the second one, is actually another who is, now you see the parallel structure that's going on here. So what this actually clues us into is that there are two main verses to the hymn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the he is, and I'm going to replace it, both of them, with who is, because that helps to show that this is what's really going on behind the English that you see. This is what's actually going on in Greek. Now, another way that we can tell that there are really two verses to the hymn, two main parts, is by what follows these who is statements. What you have here are two statements made about Christ. You have who is the image of the invisible God, and who is the firstborn of all creation. Now, in the second part, you have who is the beginning, and who is the firstborn from the dead. Now, what I want to do here is I want to highlight some of the structure that we see here, and I'm going to sort of mess around with how the text looks on the screen so that it makes everything a little bit more clear. So, who is the image of the invisible God and the firstborn of all creation? Now, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to stick this down here. Verse 16 doesn't actually go there, but what I'm doing right now is I'm putting it there just temporarily. And I'm going to do the same thing with verse 18, who is the beginning and who is the firstborn from the dead. And I'm putting this other part down here, that in everything he might be preeminent, and everything after that, it's going underneath as well. That's not where it's going to end up. We're just putting it there for the moment. But if you see, you've got who is, and then you've got these two statements made about Christ there. And if I were able to draw some little lines with my program here, I would draw some lines that go back up here and point out that these two things explain this. Who is Christ, who is both of these things. I don't know how to make little lines in my program very quickly. It would take forever. And so you'll just have to imagine some lines. And the same thing happens down here. Who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, and both of these point back up there. Now, something else we should notice is that there is the double use of the word firstborn here and here. Do you see that? Firstborn of all creation, firstborn from the dead. Firstborn from the dead sounds like it makes pretty good sense. Firstborn of all creation, not exactly sure what that means. We're going to get into that more when we actually start covering these verses. Right now we're just talking about structure. There was a lot of argument in the early church about that, and we'll talk more about that when we cover verse 15. But right now what you should see is that firstborn here and firstborn here are parallel. So what we're going to do is going to make that bold, or make that bold, just so that sticks out. So you can already see how these two verses in the hymn, not verses in the letter, because obviously each of them is more than one verse long. You can already start to see how these two verses parallel one another. You see how there's an obvious structure. You have the who is in both. You have the two statements made about Christ, and then you have calling him the firstborn of something. But it goes a lot deeper than that. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at why he is the firstborn. So in verse 16, who is the firstborn from the dead? And then you have a for. This is another one of those cases where I think the English is a little too smooth. The Greek word behind it can mean for. It can also mean because. And I think because makes a bit better sense, because what you're getting here in verse 16 is the reason why he is the firstborn of all creation. And I'm going to do the same thing here in verse 19. Because in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Because it's the same word, same construction, and this is both of these two things are parallel, which we will again see a little bit later. So because of some set of things, Christ is the firstborn of all creations. Well, what are those things? We have, by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers and authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And then what we have here is some other stuff after that. Let me put that down here for the moment, and we will address this further in just a few minutes. But for right now, let's just focus on verse 16, and then we'll get to 17, the first part of 18. So by him, all things were created. Okay. Now you've got in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And then you have this other bit about thrones or dominions, rulers and authorities. Now let me show you something. What if we do this, and then that, and that. Because by him all things were created is this statement here, and then you've got a whole bunch of things, and then all things were created through him and for him. See how this statement here lines up with this one? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But then you have all these other things in the middle. Now let's take a look at those for a minute. In heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. What you have here is what's known as a chiasm. Chiasm, think of like an X structure. So you have heaven that matches with invisible, and earth that matches with visible. See how the X happens here? Heaven and invisible, earth and visible. See it? This is a common feature of Hebrew poetry. A large portion of the Old Testament is actually poetry, and it's not just the Psalms like you think of, but a lot of what you see like in the prophets, for example, is poetry. The thing is, Hebrew poetry didn't work like poetry would now, or like you would think of songs, where you would have the first and the third verses and the second and fourth verses sort of pairing up with a last word of the first line, the last word of the third line sound alike, and the last word of the second line and the last word of the fourth line sound alike, like any song that you might hear on the radio. Hebrew poetry worked with what's known as parallelism, where things like in one line would parallel things in the next line, either by saying the same thing or sometimes by saying the opposite. Think of Proverbs. Once you get through the first part of it, I think maybe 8 chapters or so, that talks about wisdom. You get into all those There's many chapters where like each verse is its own thing. And they'll say something one way in one line, and then like the very next line, like the other half of the verse, they'll say the same thing just in a slightly different way. That's poetry. That's parallelism. And we see this here. Heaven, invisible, earth, visible. This is a Hebrew poetic way of referring back to all things. So, by him, by Christ, all things were created. Well, what are all things? Well, everything in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. It's a poetic way of saying all things, both redundantly and emphatically. So it's a way of really, really emphasizing this point that all things were created by Christ. Not just some things, not many things, but all things. And then you have here this thrones or dominions, rulers and authorities. There's a lot of argument about what these exactly refer to, but the basic idea is here that this is some sort of authority or power, rulers, and it's not 100% clear whether it's a spiritual, like a heavenly power, like angels and demons sort of thing, or whether it's an earthly power or earthly rulers. But you really don't have to separate between the two, because in the ancient mind they weren't separated. If you're polytheistic, the gods were often responsible for the destinies of different nations. Or in Judaic thinking, where there was only one God, you would still have angels responsible for different things. You might look at the book of Daniel to see some examples of this, or like where they refer to the different princes of different nations. Princes in that particular case is often thought to refer to angelic, either good or bad, figures. So the spiritual and the earthly worlds were not disconnected. So all things were created, heaven and earth, visible and invisible. This means everything. And then thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, all power structures, whether spiritual or earthly, all power structures were also created by Christ. And this will have specific application to their lives, and we will get to that when we actually go through these verses. But the point is that these power structures were created by Christ, and there's a theological implication of that. Finally, we come to all things were created through him and for him. Sort of that, with this first line here, sort of gives bookends to this statement. So everything was created by Christ. Now, let's go down to this second main verse. Who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. And then we have our because here, just like we have our because up here in verse 16, we have a because here. The only difference in the structure between these two verses is that in everything he might be preeminent. This is a line that sort of breaks from the structure that you have between part A and part B. But really what it's due is to re-emphasize that Christ is first in everything. So he's the firstborn of all creation, and he is the firstborn from the dead. So you've got this one little line in here that tries to make it clear that this him itself refers to everything. So lest you should try to think of something that's not included in creation, or as we will see, the renewal of creation here in the second verse, he is first in all things. So yet again, emphasizing Christ is first. Anyway, so we've got another because, just like we had up here in the first part. Because in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Now, trying to sort this out is going to be a little trickier than it was in the first verse of the hymn, but that's because the English is a little confused. The word order is different, so I'm going to have to mess with that a little bit as we go through it. But before I just start moving things around, let me show you what's going on here so that you'll understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. So He is the firstborn from the dead because in him, then you have was pleased. This is the primary verb that's going to be here. So in him, all the fullness of God. Okay, you've got a subject. Was pleased. And now the fullness was pleased to do two things. One, to dwell. And number two, to reconcile. You see that? Fullness of God was pleased. There's your main verb. To do two things. To dwell and to reconcile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mess with the structure here to highlight the fact that we just looked at, that you have was pleased, to dwell, and to reconcile. So in him, all the fullness of God, we're going to take that out. Was pleased. And we're going to move this, put the fullness of God there, because in him was pleased all the fullness of God to dwell. So we put that back. And through him to reconcile. I'm actually going to take this out as well. Let's put that down here for a minute. To reconcile. I'm actually make this a little bit clearer. I'm going to do that. Because in him was pleased. Here's our main verb. All the fullness to do two things. One, to dwell, and two, to reconcile. So you see that? I moved things around a little bit, but you still got the main idea here. Christ is the firstborn from the dead because in him was pleased. What was pleased? All of the fullness of God to dwell, and through him to reconcile. To reconcile what? All things where? To himself. Okay. Then we have this last little bit here. And it's not going to be simple, so I'm going to have to mess with this also. So you're making peace by the blood of his cross. That needs to go here. To reconcile all things. Okay, so he's reconciling all things. Where is he reconciling them? To himself. How is he reconciling them? Making peace by the blood of his cross. And then we also have all things, whether on earth or in heaven. So these actually, we would draw, if we were drawing lines again, these would go up here to all things. Just like you had up here, all things were created, and then you've got heaven on earth, and you've got all things here. All things are what? All things are reconciled. So all things were created, all things are reconciled. What are all things? Whether in earth or in heaven. So you see that? Now we've got our who is, and so forth. And the two statements about Christ in both the first and the second. You have the because that explains why Christ is the firstborn both of creation and from the dead. And then all things on earth were created in him. And then here you have all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell and to reconcile all things, whether on earth or in heaven. So I told you that structure carries meaning. Look at what's going on here. You have original creation, right? Christ is responsible for all things. There's nothing that is left out from creation. And the author of the hymn went to great pains to explain that nothing was left out from the hymn. Or nothing was left out from the things that Christ created. And then, again, in the second verse of the hymn, the author went to great pains to point out that nothing was left out from the things that Christ reconciled, making peace by the blood of his cross. And I mean, you can even see this in some other little details that you wouldn't pick up on because, again, the English sorts things out a little bit differently. There's pronoun uses here in verse 16 and verse 19 and 20. For by him all things were created through him and for him. And you actually have the same thing down here. You have in him, through him, and to him. Now, again, these in Greek are actually the same thing. So we could say, in him, all things, I'm going to underline this because that'll make it easier to see. In him, all things were created through him. And I'm going to change this to him. However, for him actually makes better sense because they were created for Christ, not created to Christ. But this is a Greek word that you're going to find behind it, and I'm going to show you the parallel structure with the second verse of the hymn. You got in him, through him, and where's that last one? To him. See that? In, through, to, in, through, to. It's just one more way that the author of the hymn was trying to make these two things clear, that everything was created in Christ. And then in Christ, everything was reconciled. So original creation, the renewal of creation, is extremely important to see that Christ is the one solving everything and putting it back to the way it was supposed to be. Now, we're almost done, but we haven't dealt with this little bit in the middle, right? We just sort of stuck it off there and ignored it. So let's take care of that. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. Now what we can actually do is we can break this down into three different parts. You've got an and. And even before that, you also have he is, and so you have a he is here with an in him in between. So you've got these three lines that are all put together basically by themselves that sort of form a middle verse, if you will, or sort of a transitional verse, because they're not part of this main first one. They're not part of this main second one. And there is no who is. I mean, you've got some he is in here, but it's not the same. So they don't really stack up to the same level as 1 and 2. It's sort of a transition. And you'll see why that is in a minute. And he is before all things. Okay, that sounds a lot like the first verse. And in him all things hold together. This speaks to the continual creation or the continued actions of Christ in the world. That's what the verse behind, or the Greek word behind hold together really means. It speaks to the continuing actions of Christ in the world. Now the interesting thing comes in this last line, and he is the head of the body of the church. So stuck in between this original creation and stuck in here between this reconciliation of creation, you have a statement about Christ continuing to work in the world and this line about the church. Why? Why do you think that there would be something like this in between? Well, think of this hymn as sort of a story. You have the original creation here, and then here you have the reconciliation of creation. If there's a need to reconcile creation, we got to ask the question: why does creation need to be reconciled? I mean, wouldn't Christ have made it good in the first place? I mean, why does it need to be fixed if it's not broken? And most scholars think that there is something that happened after original creation, sort of in here that's not really written, where things sort of went bad. There was a fall. And because of the fall, there was a need for things to get sorted out. There was a need for Christ to fix what was wrong, or at least was less than ideal with creation. And here you have, hold together, the verb that's talking about the continued actions of Christ in the world, and then you have this line about the church. And what I think is going on here, what I think the hymn author is saying, and I think why Paul is quoting this, is because there's a statement being made about the importance of the church. The way Christ is working in the world is through the church. The way Christ is working to sort out what went wrong with his original creation, which presumably would have been good, and get to the point where reconciliation will happen is through the church. The church is the body in whom reconciliation has already and is already taking place, and the ones through whom Christ is working to bring that reconciliation to the world. So those who are part of the church are actually the ones who have been reconciled to their Creator and are responsible for acting on the Creator's behalf to help take that reconciliation to the rest of creation. So for those of us in the church, that is our job. And I told you that structure carries meaning. You have here, in a compact 6 verses, the entirety of the story of God and man. You have original creation, and though it's not mentioned, you have a fall sort of in this line here where nothing happens. It's not talked about. But then you have the end that has already been written. Christ has already done what needed to be done by rising from the dead, making peace by the blood of his cross, so that reconciliation of all things to himself, whether on earth or in heaven, can and will happen. And the way we get from here to here, or rather from the fall to here, is by means of the church. The way Christ is working in the world today is through the church. So that's the structure of the hymn. That's what we're looking at. Now, over the next several weeks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going in detail to what all of these things mean. What does it mean to be the image of the invisible God? What does it mean to be the firstborn of all creation? What is the beginning, firstborn from the dead, and so forth? What is reconciliation? What does it mean for the fullness of God to dwell in Christ? We're going to get into all of that. But here's the big picture, and you will probably want to come back and take another look at this at some point, because this is a way that we can see sort of the whole. And as we go in detail, we're going to be looking at all the individual parts. But by connecting the parts back into the whole, you can have a much deeper appreciation for what the big picture is, as well as what it means in all of its small details. So I hope that's been interesting to you, and stay tuned for future episodes as we go into detail in the hymn.